Today's guest is a retired police officer with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, with experience in federal investigations and organised crime. Over the past 33 years, he has impacted thousands of lives and is now improving law enforcement agencies globally with breakthroughs in neuroscience. Today, he's going to share with you new insights, ideas, and information to understand how your brain fingerprint works. Would you please help me welcome to the live stream Dr. Michel Funicelli? Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. What a wonderful career, and I'd like to learn, what were some of your highlights from 33 years in law enforcement?
I would say, I listed three. Working for an organized crime, anti-organized crime task force for the better half of my career. So in other words, 15 years, really showed me how large organized crime and how complex organized crime can be. And I learned so much out of that stay during organized crime. We tackled several criminal organizations, namely the Italian mafia in Montreal. So we utilized all kinds of sophisticated techniques, including wiretap and all kinds of other interesting techniques. And the second one was probably not so well known, but I became a labor leader within the RCMP. The RCMP was the last police force to be unionized, and I led the labor movement. And it took us, because I was not alone, it was a team. So it took us about 20 years to achieve that goal. It was really a David and Goliath type of battle. And lastly, basically, I worked for 33 years, and I like to mention the fact that it was all operational frontline policing. So I'm really a cop's cop. Not to belittle my colleagues who have worked maybe in administrative roles, because that's also important. But I was an operational kind of guy, and basically that's what that explains or that identifies who I am.
Mm. Now, what you're doing today complements what you've been doing for the past 33 years, but now you're making the shift over to the field of neuroscience. So why have you made that shift from the police force into neuroscience?
Well, sometimes you make a shift in your life and you don't know. Sometimes it's just a spark of a discussion. Well, that was exactly my case when we were undergoing a criminal investigation, criminal organized crime investigation, and I was having a discussion with a senior officer and about interviewing and we had a difference of opinion, and basically I lost the battle, but because he was senior to me. But I'd like to think that I will win the war because the brain fingerprint technique that I'll explain in a few minutes, I think really has great potential. So what brought me to this is basically a shift of insight into what works best for law enforcement that brought me to in an area that I would have never thought to be studying, going back a number of years when I first began university.
So diverse. I remember my family, we were involved in a pawnbroking business, and we were there for 17 years. And we had a lot of close connections with the local police. And we also went through a royal commission during that time.
Yes. Yeah.
And it was very interesting to see the work that the police had to do, especially in the organised crime arenas. It was quite fascinating. We've also had on one of my other live streams a gentleman by the name of Corey Jones. Now, Corey Jones was the head of SWAT in Philadelphia for 17 years. And as the head of SWAT, he was involved in more than 1,000 arrests. So, I mean, for your past history, you get to see such what I think is a very privileged part of society. You get to see the inner
Yeah.
workings of these
Oh,
things
yeah.
that we can only fantasize about during movies.
Yes, absolutely. So, well, when you're working in organized crime, it's not necessarily the quantity of arrests that you'll be doing because your investigations are take so long. I can think of one that lasted 8 years. So for 8 years, you can put away your handcuffs in your drawer and never to use them until the very end of that investigation. And this is what happened. So during my time in organized crime, we were not making loads of arrests, but we were really focusing at the top of the pyramid, trying to arrest and charge and obtain evidence. But we were also in the process doing wiretap, and that um, doing wiretap gives you a much insight into because you're into the minds and ideologies and attitudes and beliefs of people involved in organized crime because basically you're listening to their conversations, so they're sharing all their secrets, and that's of course that's where that's what we want. But it's
Hmm.
all legal, it's all obtained through federal judges approval and continuously monitored, so it's all above board.
Hmm. And today, how are you helping law enforcement agencies globally in obtaining better quality evidence in these criminal investigations?
Right. So it's through my work in with this brain fingerprinting technique that I want to improve. Basically, I cannot take the credit for that because that the credit belongs to several other scientists that preceded me. But a particular method of utilizing brain fingerprinting that I learned out of Chicago at the Northwestern University under the tutorship of the late Professor Rosenfeld in Chicago. So basically, and if I may, maybe explain what brain fingerprinting
Please.
is. So
I'm your student today.
okay, great. So, okay, brain fingerprinting is not very complicated, but let's see now. Um, Suppose a person, you and I, a person, we develop memories, we encode memories into our brain whenever we experience an event of any kind. So you can remember of yesterday, what you did yesterday, your childhood, maybe other more memorable events in your life. So we encode events. So basically, this brain fingerprinting technique is all about trying to retrieve a special brain wave that has been identified to occur in the brain when you're re-exposed again to that stimulus. If it's, let's say, if it's shown on a computer, which is what I do. I show a photograph of something or a word of something of a memorable event, and while the person has electrodes attached to their scalp, so I'm examining their electrical activity as the person is seeing either a word or an image of of a memorable event, and I analyze the brain waves, and I'm looking for a particular brainwave and the amplitude of it. And it basically, after doing a statistical analysis, it will tell me if the person um, um, significantly recalls or recognizes what they've seen. So put that into a forensic, legalistic situation. So either an eyewitness to a crime, as seen the offender, so as encoded the face of the offender. The police would then supply me with the face of their prime suspect. And this at that point is nothing different than what the police already does every day of the year, but they're simply showing photographs. Now, the specifically dealing with eyewitnesses, because we all know that eyewitnesses, the evidence is really controversial and sometimes not very accurate. This method basically removes the subjectivity of a person saying or trying to assess whether they recognize a face by simply saying, okay, well, I think it's that person, or I'm pretty sure it's that person. But really, what does that mean? I think it's that person, or I'm sure it's that person. So I can quantify that judgment by analyzing the brain waves of that person. And so that's for an eyewitness. But for a suspect, let's say suspect of a crime, and imagine any crime you can think of where there's the murder weapon, for instance, the crime scene, or the wound pattern on the victim, and then the police would supply me with these photographs. And it's important for a suspect that they would be photographs of that only the culprit and the authorities know about. So by showing these images to a suspect, and again, the suspect would be strapped with electrodes on his or her scalp. I analyze the brain waves, and if I can determine that the offender recognizes more and more probing evidence. Though, the saying, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, if it waddles like a duck, well, I guess it's a duck. So the accumulation of several pieces of key pertinent evidence would begin to show the guilt. Uh, but again, it's not a lie detection technique. It's not a technique that will judge guilt or innocence. That's up to the trier of fact.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned here these brainwave frequencies.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're invisible to the human eye,
Oh, of
but
course, yes.
through your technology, you can measure them.
Yeah.
What's the range of these frequencies? What's the lower side? What's the high side that these frequencies tend to move at?
Okay, so the brain wave that I'm interested in is called P300. P for positive. So in electricity, you've got positive and negative deflections. So when typically a P300 wave would occur at about, and the 300 stands for 300 to about 6, 7, maybe 800 milliseconds after a stimulus is shown. So, in other words, a stimulus is shown on a computer screen. So, roughly anywhere from 3 to 700 milliseconds after this stimulus that has been shown, I would expect to see, or not, depending, a strong deflection in amplitude. So, yeah, roughly speaking, that's what it is.
And some people might be familiar with galvanic skin responders, which were used as lie detector tests a long time ago. How's this technology similar, or how is it different from the galvanic skin responders?
Okay, electrodermal activity, which is measured by many times I've seen measured by attaching a little clip to your one of your fingers. So we're talking about two different things here. Electrodermal activity, or galvanic skin response, is a physiological response to either a question that you're posed or some kind of a test. Now, EEG is directly connected to the central nervous system. So we're not talking about the same two systems here, like in neurological terms. So, but they're both. Well, I've read several studies where researchers have used successfully the electrodermal response in the same kind of test, which is called a concealed information test, CIT for short. So it's the same kind of test. You show one probing stimulus assorted with a variety of neutral alternatives, and then you ask a question, or rather you do a test. So it can be done by measuring electrodermal activity, or it can be done by measuring brain waves. I chose brainwaves because it's compared, and there's been a few studies comparing brainwave, the efficiency of measuring brain waves versus electrodermal activity, and there's brainwave as a slight edge over electrodermal activity. So that's why I, I'm going for the best technique.
And let's say in the perfect world that this technology was implemented today, how would it be changing our future and crime investigations a decade from now? How would it change the world?
Well, as I began explaining earlier, either in providing a better quality of evidence for police officers, dealing again, coming back to eyewitness evidence, which is sometimes uh, proving problem, well, more than just problematic. I have two cases in mind where two gentlemen in the United States were wrongly convicted and sentenced to many years, decades in prison for having been wrongly identified by an eyewitness in both cases. And I happen to have their photographs on my wall here to remind me of why every morning when I walk into my office, why do I do research? Well, it's because of these two gentlemen, and each of them spent one of 32 years in prison, and the other one spent 42 years in prison for a crime they never committed. So I'm hoping to well to minimize or reduce or completely eliminate these type of errors, and also. This is in dealing with eyewitness evidence, but also in testing suspects. Well, I'm hoping that it will provide better quality evidence. If a suspect has stored in his or her memory crucial pieces of evidence, and the person recognizes, again, it's always key to hear that the police must not leak any key evidence. They're in police jargon, they're called hold back evidence. So in other words,
Mhm.
holding back on that crucial piece of evidence that only the police knows and only the culprit knows. So that's the type of evidence that I'm looking for. And if I'm provided that, and if a suspect consents, because it cannot be a cheat conducted if a person does not want to. So if a suspect consents, and I can either um, provide evidence for his defense, because it could be a case where the offender says it was not me. So I can provide exculpatory evidence just as much as as the evidence may be inculpatory. Excuse me, I need to take a
Mhm. Please,
sip
please,
of water.
please go for it. So, if we were to summarize this brain fingerprint, what's the most practical way we can think about the brain fingerprint?
The most practical way we can think about, well, perhaps I can say that we all experience events, and it's uh, a number of years ago, a French scientist. He was nicknamed for a while the Sherlock Holmes of France. His name was Edmund Locard. So Mr. Locard basically developed the principle that every contact leaves a trace. So we're going back, he died in 1966. So we're going back many years ago during in the prime of his career. But he basically his mentality as a forensic researcher in investigating crime scenes, he developed the notion that every contact leaves a trace. So in other words, back then, and even still today, DNA evidence is
Mm.
one such trace that a suspect leaves or collects from the scene, or maybe there's evidence that the suspect collects on his body, like a trace of blood from the victim, type of thing. So, but every contact leaves a trace. So it's unlikely that Mr. Lockhart thought ahead of time about brain fingerprinting, but it's the same principle that that every contact leaves a trace. So you have a contact with witnessing an event,
Mm.
a memorable events that leaves a trace. Every contact leaves a trace. So you have a contact with an event, it leaves a trace in in your brain. So, and it's my job and the police's job to combine together as a team, that where Now, if the police provides me with the crucial piece of evidence, then I can show it, or the pieces of evidence, to a volunteering person who would want to submit to undergo the test. And so it's really not complicated, except for the neurological aspect of understanding why we have electricity in our brain. But we all do. I mean, you and I are. If we had electrodes strapped to our scalp right now, it would show much activity because of what we're doing. So, excuse me.
Well, they might be wiretapping us today.
So yeah, that's the practicality of things.
So these fingerprints, brain fingerprints, and we thought about the sensory input channels. So it could be remembering what somebody or something looked like. Could it be the way that somebody's voice sounded, or maybe the words? Could it be that tactile sensation of the way that I was touched, or possibly the smells and the taste? Is that all involved in the brain fingerprint?
Okay, very insightful question. All right. So we know from the literature that the P300 brainwave reacts to everything that are from the everything that our five senses analyzes and comes across or detects any signal from that we touch, that we smell, that we hear, that we taste, or so all five senses, and that's basically from an evolutionary perspective. If you think back, millions and millions and millions of years ago, the Neanderthal man, the caveman, would have to make a determination whether a signal that was coming to his senses, being captured by his senses, was friendly or a foe. So if it's a smell, or a particular smell, a particular sound, is that friend or foe? He had to make that determination. So it's an evolutionary reflex that the humans have developed. So fast forward millions of years ago to today, and your question is whether whether it could be applied, that the technique could be applied. Well, so far in laboratory studies, we've only applied it to sight, in other words, seeing a particular stimulus, and sound. So the technique has not been tested with, as far as I'm concerned, in a forensic environment. That is, it has not been tested with any other stimuli, namely taste or smell or odor. So, but it is, those are future directions that we can contemplate for future research, naturally. And also maybe it might lead to medical breakthroughs, because although this is out of my comfort zone a little bit, because I'm not a health scientist, but there's memory conditions that could be studied through this technique, and there's a health condition, a memory disorder called prosopagnosia, which is terrible, and it's where a person has difficulty recognizing themselves when looking in a mirror. So there's that technique could potentially be used in that context, but I won't go any further than that, because that's really not my field of expertise.
Well, it's interesting that you mention the olfactory as well. I was in Melbourne not long ago, and I was walking down the street, and a young woman walked past, and she was wearing J'adore perfume, and I went, oh, and I turned around, and the first thought that was in my mind was ex-girlfriend. And so I was looking around thinking, I better not look, my wife might be here with me. So, we say that the sense of smell can trigger memories very quickly. sometimes faster than the other senses. I've also got somebody who lives in my building and they wear a perfume that I really dislike. And so as soon as I smell that perfume in the lift, their face comes straight to my mind. Bang, immediately, and I go, oh, that's the person. So what I want to know here, and maybe you've got the answer or not, does this work more on the short-term memory or on the long-term memory? Because I see people at an event in the morning and I'll forget who they are after lunch. But I might see them 3 or 4 years later on and I'll see their face and their name and I go, oh, hello, Dr. Michel.
Right. Okay. So, um, short-term memory, long-term memory. Okay. So far, in laboratory testing, I've read literature and I've conducted experiments myself. But in the experiments that we were doing, we were always using basically short-term memory. We would ask our participants to go through a mock event, a mock crime in my case, and then they would be tested immediately thereafter. So we're talking short-term, we're talking
Mm.
minutes, or short-term memory. Now there have been studies done to test participants after a longer period. And from memory, I can think of a couple of studies where they tested their participants a week later. And I think in Japan, some scientists have tested as far back as 6 months after the case. But in a paper that I published, this might help maybe understand a bit more. It's all about how I think it's all about how deeply encoded a stimulus particularly is. So if you undergo an event and it's just a fleeting, you develop a fleeting memory of something, it may not have been um, encoded deeply enough for this technique, because it's all it is. It's a technique,
Mm.
for the technique to be sensible enough to detect it. So now these are still unanswered research questions that I'm hoping to answer in the next few years or months or years maybe. But it all stems from the I think from the initial encoding in the paper that I published last year. Uh, Basically, I tested the people with and I showed their names, their family names. So of course, we know our family names because it's been well encoded. Because when we hear our family names mentioned, we read about it, we sign a
There's
piece
my
of
mum. There's my mum yelling at me. Oh, not that name again.
exactly. So it's a name, it's a word. The name, our last name is well encoded, but it goes back to the moment began school, and so it's in some cases, well, if depending how old you are, it could be you've been encoding it for decades. So now coming back to the perfume that you were smelling, well, perhaps it was well encoded initially at that moment when you were with that person, and she would wear that kind of perfume and she would tell you, okay, well, it's such a brand name. Well, you encoded it quite well, deeply, so that
Mm.
the next time you're exposed to that sense, to that odor, well, it evoked in you a memory. And I would bet that if at that moment that if you had the electrodes strapped on your forehead, and here I was with my apparatus, I would probably detect a P300 strong enough to say, okay, you have a memory of that. You actually have a memory of that stimulus. But in the case of forensic, I would be able to attach a figure, a mathematical figure, and this is quite important because compared to how law enforcement conduct, and I've done them myself so hundreds of times during the course of my career, but how they conduct photo parades or photo lineups,
Mm.
call it what you want. Well, right at this point, it's always a self evaluation of the witness that the police relies on. The person is presented with an array of photographs, and the person does a self-evaluation mentally. Do I recognize this person? Is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this
I
one? Oh
should
no,
recognize them.
I should.
I ought
And
to recognize them.
yeah, so there's all these questions that pop up in their head, and ultimately they arrive at a decision, whether it's yes or no. Or I don't know. I'm not sure. Perhaps. So they arrive at some kind of assessment of their memory.
Mm.
Well, that's where errors or miscarriages of justice are likely to happen, because on the witness stand, a person says, "Well, it was this person that committed XYZ crime," and a person may end up going to prison based on that piece of evidence. So that's very that's putting a lot of stress and a lot of
Mm.
probative value on a piece of evidence, which I'm hoping to with this technique to remove, in a sense that the person would not have to say anything. There's no question and answers. Basically, let your brain do the work. I'll show you photographs or words. I'll show you the stimuli on the computer screen, and you just have to follow some basic instructions with two mouse. Click here, click there, blah blah, and let your brain do the work. It's a test that only lasts 15 minutes, and it's not invasive, because I don't prick a needle or prick skin with a needle. I don't take a swab of anything. So basically, the scalp, it's an electrode attached to a person's scalp, and the person sees what they see, and I analyze their brain activity. And after 15 minutes, the test is done. I do my statistical analysis, and I come up with a number. And the number says it. It's
Mm.
what, and I would give it to the investigators, and they'll take it from there.
I love the sound of this technology. One of the things that I've learned about the unconscious mind over the years is it stores all of our memories. And a lot of the memories from the work that I do, we say that a lot of memories are symbolic in nature. So the unconscious mind presents to the conscious mind a picture, a sound, or a feeling. And if we can make sense of that symbolism, then we can connect a meaning to it. But memory retrieval in and of itself is not always accurate. And I've learned this over the years, especially with self-assessment tools. Harvard University recently released some reports saying that the average person, 95% of the population, believes that they're emotionally intelligent, yet only 10 to 15% actually are. So when they're asked to perform a self-assessment, they're actually very inaccurate. And I started to use some artificial intelligence technology to measure brainwave frequencies, to measure people's emotional intelligence. And I found it to be quite insightful, because what most people couldn't answer in a self-reflection report, the technology was able to measure the brainwave frequencies. And what we were specifically looking for was activity in the amygdala. What are the frequent and what are the core emotions? And people would say, oh, no, I don't have fear. Oh, no, I never experience guilt or anxiety. And then the technology shows those brainwave frequencies. And I believe that that similar technology used in our field is helping people have big breakthroughs, to the point that I was debriefing a report today. And I was asking my client, what was happening here at 9 years and 10 months? Oh, that's when mum and dad started fighting. Okay, what happened here at 11 and 8 months? Oh, that's when dad walked out. And I found it to be very accurate. So I'm a big believer in this technology. For people who want to learn more about the work that you're doing and connect with you, what's the best place for them to connect with you?
Well, probably my LinkedIn page, or perhaps the university where I'm at now, at Teesside University in the UK, where I teach in the policing. So either or, but probably best is my LinkedIn page.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, go over to Dr. Michael's LinkedIn page. I'm going to put the link in the show notes so you'll be able to click on it, and make sure you follow this work. And if you're living in the UK, make sure you attend one of his lectures if you get the opportunity, because I think the predictions will be true, Dr. Michel, that 10 years from now, that this will definitely change the policing and the quality of evidence that's presented. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Dr. Michel Funicelli, thank you so much for joining us here. I know it's early morning in the United Kingdom, and we greatly appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, remember, one new idea at the right time is enough to change your life. And make sure you go over to Dr. Michel Funicelli's LinkedIn page right now. The links are in the show notes below, and learn more about the good work he's doing. Thank you for your time, and have a wonderful day. Dr. Michel.